If you were to give the 1950s a theme, it would be conformity. And conformity basically means to be like everybody else, to be the same, to fit in, right? Because in the 1950s, the idea of being like everybody else is something that helped to promote the American lifestyle. And if you were a part of the American lifestyle, whether it was living in the suburbs or dressing a certain way, going to church regularly, and having a regular job and having the 2.3 children, you were fitting in. But if you didn't fit in, it meant that you were different, and being different meant that you were anti the regular lifestyle. You were on the outside looking in. And immediately there are questions, there are suspicions. Why are you on the outside? Why don't you fit in? Why aren't you making more efforts to fit in, right? Differences stoked the fears of communism. And that's an irony because in America, we value individuality above all else. The ability for the individual to speak their mind, to do what they believe in, to live how they want to live freely. But that is not the mindset of the post war America. And that's what we're going to talk about a lot today. I want to begin by showing you a commercial from the 1950s in which Ford is trying to convince you, 1950s American family, to buy a second car.
Fine. Yes, I'd love to. Thanks, Jean. I'll be there. 2:00. Goodbye. 3 weeks ago, I couldn't have accepted that invitation. Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get out to see my friends, couldn't take part in PTA activities. I couldn't even shop when I wanted to. I had to wait till Thursday night after Dave brought the car home. But that's all changed now. 3 weeks ago, we bought another Ford. The new, low-priced, custom-line Victoria. Isn't it stunning? Dave has it all to himself. And I now have the ranch wagon all to myself. It's a whole new way of life. Now I'm free to go anywhere, do anything, see anybody anytime I want to. It's only good common sense. Why be stuck with one expensive car when you can enjoy all the fun and freedom of two fine Fords?
Today, more and more families are finding out how easy it is to become two Ford families. You can choose from 20 different models, colors galore, and each available with Thunderbird power, with styling inspired by the famous Ford Thunderbird, and each with the extra protection of Ford's Lifeguard design. See your Ford dealer soon.
Okay, so here is a classic middle class family in America. And here's a woman who is talking about the restrictions that she's under or that she was under because her family only had one car. We'll call her Mary because we're never properly introduced. So Mary here, I want you to pay attention to how she's dressed, right? Keep in mind, she's at home. Okay, so she's at home, her hair is done, makeup is done, she's got a nice dress on with a string of pearls, just like all of us dress while we're at home. And she talks about why she needs the car. She needs the car to go to PTA meetings, she needs the car to go shopping, to go hang out with her friends. These are all activities that a homemaker, a stay-at-home mom would do, right? This is not Rosie the Riveter imagery, okay? And that's what I want you to keep in mind. So Rosie the Riveter is not here anymore. Rosie the Riveter has gone home, and Rosie the Riveter has become Rosie the homemaker. And she talks about their need for a second car so that she can exercise some independence, but to those activities that are specific for her, Rosie the homemaker, right? Meanwhile, Dave, the husband, the provider, can go to his business meetings, earn the money he's got to earn, wherever he's earning it, however he's earning it. And this is why we have to get a second car. Now, the idea in pre-World War II America of having two cars is strictly for the wealthiest families in America. But in 1950s America, it's very different, right? So when you see advertisements like this happening in the 1950s, immediately what I want you to understand is we are talking about a different level of wealth, a different kind of economy, and a different type of messaging. Remember, I told you that the impact of the GI Bill is that it is single-handedly responsible for expanding the middle class in a way that no bill ever had before. This is a perfect example of it. So let's talk about how this happens and why it happens, right? So the 1950s is, in a lot of instances, known as the golden age of American history. And there are a couple of reasons why. When we talk about why this name is assigned, before I get into that, why this name is assigned to this particular time period, in the 1950s, or by 1950 itself, the United States is given this new term, this new description of superpower. It's a brand new adjective, really. The United States is leading the world economically. It's leading the world technologically. It's also leading the world militarily, right? So in all of this economic growth, in all of this military expansion, in all of this technological advancement, you have an era of impact that will affect everyday Americans, right? So when we talk about this economic growth, I want to talk about why this economic growth has been happening. And it starts with military spending. Now, let me emphasize this because there are a lot of people who will take military spending and run with it in the direction that it's not meant to run. So let me explain what's going on. When we talk about military spending, in this time period, remember one of the things that I mentioned in the Cold War lecture, in the really long Cold War lecture, is that from 1945 to 1949, from 1950 to 1953, we see a shift in American policy in the fight towards communism, right? And there is an increase in the military budget. And a part of that increase is going to be towards research and development. So it's not just about sending troops to different places. It's about research and development into technologies that would advance the military, that would give the military more advanced equipment. Now, what ends up happening dates back to the early days of the war, in that there are technologies introduced to the military that end up benefiting everyday Americans. Like, for example, the GPS that we use now, and even the cellular technology that we use now, is first introduced in the early 1940s during the war, as a part of something that the Navy is introduced to. And that takes years of development, obviously, but then it's introduced to everyday America. When we talk about military research and development here, it's almost on the same level as when Truman integrates the military. What starts in the military will have an impact on everyday America, right? So let's talk about what that kind of impact is going to have. Everyday America is going to have this experience of life becoming easier and more efficient. By that I mean you now have a washer dryer inside your home. You have access to a dishwasher. You have kitchen ranges that are more efficient. You have a refrigerator that is larger and more efficient as well. You have the introduction of microwaves, right? So you'll notice in one of the ads that you see here, my new gas range dresses up the whole kitchen. This is a regular type of ad that you see normally. In fact, I used to show a commercial where two women were talking about their houses, and the house that we're looking at had been completely remodeled and updated with the latest technology, her dishwasher, washer dryer, microwave, and the other woman was bemoaning that. She was sad because her house was so outdated, and it really wasn't, but that's the complaint, right? Automation is a result of the research and development that goes into military spending. It completely changes the everyday life for the American people. And remember, when I say the American people, I'm really focusing on middle class Americans. That's really important for you to remember. Now, because there are more and more people who are joining the American middle class, what starts to happen is there are going to be more and more people who are buying houses, and in these houses, they're going to want this technology. That is where you start to see consumer demand. And it's not just going to be consumer demand for things in the home, it's going to be consumer demand for the homes themselves, right? It's consumer demand for cars. It's consumer demand for material wealth and material things in general. A couple of lectures ago, when we talked about World War II, I told you that in looking at a 10-year period, well over $4 trillion of houses had been purchased, like $4 trillion worth of loans had been financed specifically for housing through the GI Bill, right? There is a huge demand to build homes, right? And that's a part of creating this consumer demand. And remember, these guys are not just building homes for the sake of building homes. They're building homes because they have now created, or they are moving their new families into their homes. And as a result of having gotten married or been married for a couple of years, there is the unavoidable baby boom. Let's talk about the impact of the baby boom. So anytime a baby boom happens, it's referring to an increase in the overall birth rate over an extended period of time, right? And so this particular baby boom happens from 1946 to 1964. And after 1964, that's when the decline in the birth rate starts to happen. So this baby boom, interestingly enough, from 1946 to 1964, on average, every year, there were 4.24 million babies born every single year. Okay. And when we talk about the size of this entire generation, if you're looking at the entirety of how many people were born between 1946 and 1964, there are 75 million, roughly 75 million children are born during this time period. That's a lot of kids. It is a lot of kids. And that means that there are things that these babies need. Babies are expensive. Babies were expensive then, they're expensive now, right? So you've got to pay for stuff to feed the baby, clothe the baby, you've got to shelter the baby, you've got to educate the baby, right? And then the baby's going to have to go to the doctor at some point, and you're going to have to, get the baby involved in things, right? Babies are expensive, and they're lifetime investments. And especially when you have multiple babies, there is an increase on the demand for what you need to support that family, right? So when we talk about how important this is, keep in mind that after or during the Great Depression and World War II, there is a huge decline in the birth rate because people are delaying marriage. People are delaying having children because they don't want to take on that expense. They don't want to take on the expense of having a family during time periods where there is economic hardship. And they certainly don't want to take on the burden of possibly becoming a single parent, right? During a time of war, if your spouse goes off to fight in Europe and doesn't come back and you have children to raise, that's a very difficult position to be in. And so when this baby boom happens, it's almost in response to the declining rates of those two eras, right? And so the baby boom helps to explain why there's so much in consumer demand. These four things help to explain this economic growth. But I want to get into where people are going and where people are living. In the 1950s, you start to see the development of things called the Levitt towns. A Levitt town was essentially the early version of suburbs. Suburbs are neighborhoods just outside of cities. A suburban area is essentially neighborhoods that make up smaller cities outside of the major city. So if you're looking at Oklahoma City, suburbs would be neighborhoods that make up places like Yukon and Mustang or Piedmont. Those would be suburbs of Oklahoma City, right? That's the thing. In these neighborhoods, you start to see houses that are all similar to each other. They're all built in the same way. They have the same floor plan, or they all average, three bedrooms, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, 1 car garage, 2 car garages, but they all have the same look. Everything is very similar to each other. It's the same amount of land that they have. Fences are exactly the same. Everybody's got one tree in their front yard. Everything looks exactly like each other. And the first real experiment with that kind of living arrangement is a Levittown. The first Levittown is built in New York, and the idea really sort of spurs on and spreads across the country. What this suburban nation does is it creates a separation between both races and classes. And that's what I want you to understand. When you have the development of suburbia, middle-class people who had been working and just earning a better living were now separating themselves from working-class people. And that's important because the idea is the attraction of the suburb was you don't have to live in the same area or in the same neighborhood where you work. You can work downtown, but then you can drive 10, 15, 20 minutes and be home. And it doesn't have to be so close to each other. You can create a separation for yourself. But what you're also doing is you're creating a classist separation, right? Where working class people live there in the city and middle class people live in the suburbs, right? It's also racially driven in that, and I kind of touched upon this in the World War II lecture, in that a lot of these houses were not made available to Black residents. So Black veterans, for example, were not given the same access to housing loans in the same way that white veterans were. And because here's how the GI Bill worked, right? The GI Bill had to be funded by a bank. And if banks didn't finance the loan, then then that loan's not going to come through, and you're not going to get what you need. So the bank can deny you, a black veteran, and your family from getting the funding you need to build your house where you want to build it. And a lot of times banks refused to fund loans for black neighborhoods in general, right? So it becomes very difficult and very problematic. So when we talk about the development of suburbs in the United States, suburbs are mostly white middle class America. And white middle class America becomes the face and the image of the golden age. So when we talk about this golden age of American history, it is embodied by the white middle class family. You can see a picture of them there in the cover of Life magazine, right? I don't mean literally, I mean as an example. There's dad and mom and the three daughters, right? The American and His Economy, as it says right there on the front page. And talks, they're looking out the window of their home, and I don't know if you can see this, but let me see if I can point this out. Right here it talks about family buys best $15,000 house. $15,000. Okay, I just wanted to throw that out there. $15,000. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to talk about how this white middle class family starts to embody the lifestyle of the 1950s and why that becomes the image, right? Because if you were a white working class family, then you're not going to fit this image. White working class America was seen as having a different set of morals, a different set of values, so they're marginalized. And people of color immediately marginalized. It's very different because white middle class America were seen as the goal of what an American should strive for. So when we talk about the lifestyle of the 1950s, a lot of this is really reiterated by the values of consumerism and conformity. Consumerism, of course, is something that we have talked about since the very beginning of this class, especially when we started to get into the progressive era and talking about the American buyer. Consumerism is the idea that you should be able to buy stuff and buy things freely, right? If you can afford it, buy it. But when we get to the 1950s, consumerism helps to prove your standing in American society. It helps to prove that you're middle class, but it also helps to prove how American you are, right? So for example, if your neighbor has 2 cars, then it's best that you have 2 cars. If your neighbor has a certain type of, wardrobe that, displays their wealth and also explains how advanced they are in their career or whatever, then it's best that you do the same thing, right? It's maybe you've heard of the phrase keeping up with the Joneses. It's that kind of mentality, being able to buy stuff to send out the message that economically you are buying into this American capitalist mindset, right? That you can fit in economically, right? So that, and if you can stay ahead of the curve, then you stay ahead of the curve. But if they have all of the available technologies in their kitchen, you should get the available technologies in your kitchen. If your neighbor has 2 cars, you get 2 cars. It's the same sort of thing, right? On the second hand, there's conformity, right? We talked about conformity at the beginning of this lecture. Conformity is about fitting in. So conformity is how your behaviors reflect you, how your family's behaviors reflect yourselves, and whether or not you are a reflection of American values and American traditions. So these questions of whether or not you go to church every Sunday, what kind of work does your husband do? Are you a working woman? If so, why? Or as a wife, are you volunteering somewhere? Who do you socialize with? Who comes to visit you? Why are they coming to visit you? Those sort of things are not just about gossip, right? It becomes a part of this idea that everybody is watching everybody else. Remember, we are living in an atmosphere of fear where you have to watch everybody. You can't trust anybody. And so if everybody's watching you and you're watching them, then a part of your observances will be to see what their behaviors are like. And it is in your best interest to fit in as best as possible. Now, I don't know if I have this on here or not, but no, I don't. So let me add this really quickly. This lifestyle of the 1950s is reinforced by popular culture. And this is going to be different than what we talked about in the last lecture, where the American government, I told you that government agencies were creating things. In the 1950s, you start to see television shows that are going to reiterate this message. So there are television shows like, I think the quintessential show is a show called Father Knows Best, where there is a father, wife, and 3 kids, and these in every single episode there is some sort of drama that unfolds in 20 minutes or so, and it's the father of the family who always ends up resolving the issue somehow or another. The mother is a stay-at-home mom. Father is someone who works. The children, of course, go to school. There is one episode, of course, where it's the Thanksgiving episode, and so the father, it's very clear that the father comes home. The Thanksgiving meal goes awry, but no matter what, when they gather together, the father makes sure that he prays over the meal. So it's very much in conjunction with or aligning with these American values. Leave It to Beaver is also a very popular show where Beaver is the younger son who is always up to some sort of antic or troublemaking stunt. But it's the same sort of dynamic. A father, a mother, 2 children this time, but the mother stays at home, father works, 2 kids are off to school. The popular culture helps to reinforce the 1950s lifestyle. When we talk about this entire system, right, of a middle-class economy that constantly demands change, constantly demands stuff, material stuff and material wealth, it feeds into an economy that grows and grows and grows. And because it grows, the American status on a global scale is empowered, right? The United States as a global leader isn't just a global leader in terminology. By investing in countries in Europe to rebuild, that helps our status as well in terms of power, right? So there is a diplomatic level of authority that we have in addition to economic and military power that we have. And that's important for you to remember. Now, let's get to the shortcomings of the Golden Age, which we sort of hit on, but let's get into the details of it, right? So when we talk about the Golden Age and for who it's for, I want you to notice that top picture there. This is just outside of Detroit. This type of sign is typical across the country. This is not just in one place. This is typical across the country. When you start to see construction of homes in new areas, builders or construction companies would often put up signs like this in which they would say or they would announce that this land was exclusive and restricted. And the message was always the same, that if you were black, don't even bother trying to build a house here. You would not be included here. And this happens a lot, and this is regardless of economic status, because keep in mind, there are plenty of Black Americans who are professionals, who are college educated, who earn money, who do really well, but because they are Black, they don't have access to the same kind of economic benefits that their white counterparts do, right? And a lot of this is due to the phenomenon that we talked about in the previous slide, and that is this phenomenon that historians and sociologists will refer to as white flight. That is the escape of the white middle class from the cities of America, right? And it's not to say that white Americans didn't go downtown or didn't go to downtown areas. It's that they no longer wanted to live there, be there, or invest there. So if you want to look at or think about the long-term effects of this, you don't see it now because across the country there has been so much of an effort over the last decade, 2 decades, to invest in downtown areas, whether we're talking about Oklahoma City, Kansas City, cities across the country really, to reinvigorate their downtown areas. But Oklahoma City in the 80s and 90s, nothing like this. Nothing like what you see now. It was destitute. It was dangerous. It was not somewhere you wanted to be after dark. And a lot of that is due to the fact that starting in the 50s, so many people had left Oklahoma City. They no longer invested in Oklahoma City. And when they took their money out of these areas, it left a vacuum, right? And so instead what starts to happen, you start to see these lines that are created, these divisions that are created. So when I say segregated landscape, I don't just mean segregated across racial lines. I mean segregated across economic lines as well. The other thing that I do want to emphasize here is that there is an effort made to, some kind of effort made to create housing opportunities for the poor, for working class, for minorities. And Congress will present a bill in which they push for these housing opportunities. In larger cities, places like Philly and Detroit, Los Angeles will have these as well. But this is especially true on the East Coast, where cities were becoming crowded. You start to see funding go into what's called public housing, or what we would know as the projects, right? These are buildings that are not regularly maintained, buildings that are grossly underfunded, and after years of wear and tear, because of underfunding and mismanagement, they become also incredibly dangerous. So the idea was, well, at least we've got places for them to live. And of course, it's all presented under the guise of urban renewal, that we're investing in our cities. This is the place for you to be, but it's really not the place for anybody to be, right? So on a slightly different note, but it's totally related to this idea of going against this golden age philosophy, is the role of religion. So I've mentioned this a couple of times, that a part of the idea of conformity is your adherence to these American traditional values. What forces itself into this idea of traditional values is this idea that Americans regularly go to church and Americans are a religious people. Is that true? Not necessarily. But what starts to happen is in the post-war American world, Christian leaders in particular start to tie themselves strongly to the anti-communist movement. The idea that Christianity in and of itself is very much anti-communist, and American Christianity in particular has American Christianity is a part of the campaign to fight back against communism, becomes especially significant because this is where you start to see images like you see on the bottom right of the screen. So here is, let me get my little marker here. So here is the American family, mom, dad, son and daughter. And here is their nice middle-class American home with the tree in the yard. So typical. But I want you to notice the three things that are portrayed in the background, right? Here is where dad works and where the smokestacks are there. That's how you know it's where he works, right? That's a factory or an industry of some kind, right? This right here, that's where the kids go to school, right? Because there's no other choice. There's no other option available. So that's where they go to school. And this, of course, right here with the huge steeple is a church. So work, school, church. And you'll notice this message at the bottom. These are fundamental. These are these three things. These three things are fundamental. And the messaging is that to have a stable, successful American life, you have to have these three things as a part of your foundation, a church being one of them, right? A religious identity, a religious affiliation. So a part of what becomes a part of what comes in the messaging of this anti-communist movement when it comes to religion is the idea that we have to put this religious messaging into very public spaces. So, for example, the phrase, "In God we trust," is printed on the dollar or American money in general. That is not the motto of the United States. The United States motto is "E pluribus unum," out of many one. But they print the phrase "In God we trust" as a message almost, and a deterrent against the communist threat, right? Because what American Christians are going to argue is that communists are atheists and communists cannot affiliate themselves with things that are inherently tied to a God, but especially the Christian God. Another thing that will come up, there is a minister, I forgot his name, but there's a minister who presents a petition that's signed by thousands, by the way. But he presents this petition to Congress, and the petition says that we need to add the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. So we had the Pledge of Allegiance, but it did not include the phrase "one nation under God." So Congress actually, in the 1950s, presents legislation, and it is passed to include the phrase "under God." The argument here is not as a statement of faith. I have to emphasize that. It's not so that Americans can make their statement of faith. It's a way to flush out communists. What some people argue here is that when ordered to say, or when asked to say the Pledge of Allegiance, communists will not be able to say or utter the words "under God," because as atheists, it would betray their core belief system. And I don't know, their heads would explode. I don't know what the theory is behind that. But essentially, the idea is that if they, choke on the words "under God," then that's how you know they're a communist. Okay, what I want you to understand is something really important is happening here, because it's not just religion tying itself to the anti-communist movement. What you're starting to see here is religion starting to show signs of tying itself to a political movement. It's not happening just yet. It's pointing towards that, okay? This is where they start. They start with anti-communism because they believe communists are against everything that Christians stand for. There's one nation under God. And that's what leads me to this point of the new conservatives. When we talk about religion and politics, and we're going to see this a couple of lectures from now, you start to see more people try to think about or consider what role religion should have in this larger conversation about politics. That if religion is tied to the American traditional life, then a part of that tradition should be how people shape their political opinions. And most of the people who are adhering to or tying themselves to this religious moment will be conservative Republicans. Not all Republicans, let me emphasize that. Not all Republicans, but really conservative Republicans. Okay, so speaking of Republicans, I've got to talk about the head of the Republican Party and the President of the United States, who was elected in the 1950s. In 1952, he's elected, and that is General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower is the guy who he really embodies what it means to be a Republican in the 1950s, but more so than that, he embodies what it means to be an anti-communist president. And that's really important here too. When we talk about Eisenhower's career, okay, let me just say Eisenhower has the greatest title in the history of mankind when he serves during World War II. So he's a general, obviously, and he served as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. I mean, obviously, I'm never going to have that rank, but if I can find a way, listen. And then he goes from that, becomes a 5-star general, and then moves on to politics. And his goal is to help the country transition into a state of preparedness, right? That the country will always be ready for anything that the communists present. Communism, fighting against communism is his number one priority. And that's something that you need to remember. More so than anything else, we have to be ready to fight back against communism. His vice president, the guy sitting on the right-hand side here. So this is Dwight Eisenhower. This right here is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had been a congressman from California, then he became a senator from California, had a long career in Congress. Then he was asked to serve as Eisenhower's vice president. And listen, Nixon is a really smart politician and quite effective as even as a diplomat, someone to represent the Eisenhower administration. Younger, significantly younger than Eisenhower, as you can see. But he is also someone who fully embraces Eisenhower's approach to anti-communism. However, something that you should remember for later on is that Nixon is also someone who's willing to embrace the idea of having conversations, at the very least having conversations with communist leaders. And that's going to be important too. So when we talk about Eisenhower's approach here to politics in general, Eisenhower sort of represents what's considered a modern version of republicanism, right? And this era of republicanism is not the conservative Republicans that I had talked about on the previous slide, right? Listen, Dwight Eisenhower is a very religious man, but that's not what's shaping his agenda. He is thinking about the United States as an international power, and he is considering the country's role in fighting for and representing the cause of democracy. He believes very strongly in not just the cause of democracy, but he believes very strongly in the value and the protection of individual rights. And it's important that you remember that. He values that. He prioritizes individual rights. And he believes that there is something to the cause that we have to protect. And that's something that not only we have to protect here in the United States, but abroad as well. And so, in the name of that, and in the name of preparedness, Eisenhower promotes a couple of things that affect everyday American life. One of them is the creation of the interstate highway system. You can see a map of that right there in front of you. So the reason why we have I-40, I-44, I-35, Highway 1 out in out on the West Coast, like all of that, or Highway 5 on the West Coast, Highway 1 on the East Coast. All of these interstates are established as a result of something that Eisenhower pushes, and they are not created for our traveling purposes. They are created for the purpose of the military. He says that if there is another time of war, and if there is a need for the military to transport materials from one coast to another, one city to another, they should not have to resort to using regular roads or back roads or anything like that. They should be able to use the highways. The highways will make transportation easier. And in the meantime, Americans start to use highways as a means of travel and being able to commute back and forth to work or whatever. It's another example of military spending that ends up benefiting regular everyday Americans, right? The other thing that Eisenhower pushes for is the National Defense Education Act. So the National Defense Education Act is actually passed in response to the fact that the Soviet Union had successfully launched a satellite into space. The satellite that we're talking about is something known as Sputnik. So Sputnik had been launched. It's the first artificial satellite, and it's launched into space in 1957. And so Eisenhower says, okay, this is a problem because it means that we are running behind the Soviets in space exploration. And so what he pushes for is for more students to be invested in science, technology, mathematics, engineering, so STEM education. But it's essentially another way that the federal government is investing in higher education. So for those students who are majoring in science, technology, engineering, and math, the National Defense Education Act would help to fund those students' educations, fund their research, help them find jobs, whatever, as long as those careers or their research would help benefit the Americans in terms of national security, space exploration, whatever. It's a huge part of not just funding higher education, but again, this idea that we have to be able to compete, if not lead, in the war against communism. This is also a time where you start to see Eisenhower take a much more active response in his fight against communism. But in this action, I've got to talk about, and I don't think I have it up here, but he uses something called, he believes in something called the domino effect when it comes to communism. He says, when one country falls to communism, countries around it will also fall. And so to stop that from happening, we have to get in the way. we have to get in the way of the spread of communism, but he does not believe in sending in the military to do that. Instead, he wants to send in special ops. He wants to send in the CIA, and that's typically what he does, which leads me to Vietnam, right? So I talked about in the last lecture the origins of Vietnam, the Vietnam conflict. During the Geneva Accords is when, and we don't need to get into that in detail, during the Geneva Accords is when globally you have the first real talk about Vietnam in general. And you know, Roosevelt had heard about it in the 1940s. The Geneva Accords take place in 1954. And you know, this is designed, obviously, for larger issues, but the primary purpose of the Geneva Accords is to, you know, settle what had happened in Korea. Let's talk about how we move on from Korea. So it settles the fact that, you know, there's going to be a demilitarized zone, and you're going to have a North Korea and a South Korea. But the issue that comes up that will now be addressed on a international scale will be French Indochina, the colonies that France has control of in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, right? So there's Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And Eisenhower tells France, now Eisenhower is, you know, of course, updated on what's going on and what the Americans have been doing so far. And the problem for France is France hasn't gotten anywhere in their fight against the communist revolutionaries of Vietnam. And this is what I want you to remember. Vietnam is a very poor country. Most of the people there are living in destitute conditions. Under French control, there is very little economic opportunity. Okay, very little. So these people are very poor. But think about this for a second. The French had been fighting the Vietnamese since the late 1940s and still cannot declare victory in Vietnam. So it tells you how fervent these people are in fighting for the cause of their own independence. So at the Geneva Accords, Eisenhower tells France, listen, y'all need more help. We've been sending you money, but you obviously don't know what you're doing. So we're going to send in military advisors. And you're going to need to listen to what they tell you to do because you clearly have not a single clue. So Eisenhower turns up the level of American involvement. So now we're not just sending them stuff, we're sending them advisors on how to develop a strategy. And again, this is without the American people knowing. So the Americans don't know what's going on. Okay. So now that we know how the American society overall is supposed to look, what the norm is supposed to be, I want to talk about the people who push back against the norm, the people who rebel. And that's what this screen is all about. This is about transitioning or challenging conformity. So I want to start with a very brief clip. I'll stop it in the middle from a guy named Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry is considered the father of rock and roll, and he is singing a semi-autobiographical song called Johnny Be Good.
Go,
So that is Chuck Berry playing for an audience of entirely white people, all of them young people, I need to emphasize, and he's playing with an entirely white band, right? But here is this black artist telling the story of a guy named Johnny B. Good. And the story of this character or of this person is someone who is born in poverty, not educated, but the one thing that he can do is play the guitar, right? And in the second verse, you could hear the story of how he essentially lives by the railroad tracks, and he carries his guitar in a gunny sack, right? And then you hear him play the guitar, and you see him dancing around with the guitar. The beat is loud and in your face, and so is how he performs and how he dances. And at some points, you can see members of the audience, not all of them, but members of the audience clapping. Yes, on the 1 and the 3, but we won't talk about that. But they're enjoying it. Rock and roll for the baby boomer generation is what jazz was for the 1920s generation. Okay. The difference, though, is that rock and roll it has a much broader appeal. It's not just for young, wealthy, white audiences, it also appealed to black audiences as well. But among white audiences, jazz appealed mainly towards the wealthier side of white audiences. Rock and roll is much broader, and a lot of that is due to the fact that radio and television helped to broadcast it on a broader, wider scale, right? And just like jazz, similarly to jazz, rock and roll starts among black musicians. Like I said, Chuck Berry is considered the father of rock and roll, but there are black women who are at the forefront of rock and roll music. And this is a terrible sign to the World War II generation, right? Who have been at times given the nickname the greatest generation, because they see this as a sign of rebellion, that you are listening to loud music, and these are suggestive dance moves, and why are you listening to this kind of music? What does it tell you? What does it have to offer you? Let me show you a part of the reason why it continues to spread so widely. So remember, when we talk about this particular generation, the baby boomers are born into an America that no other generation has ever been born into, right? It's a level of economic success and stability that no one has ever known, which is really weird to say, but I promise there's an explanation to it. So, as they're born into white middle-class suburbia, a lot of white middle-class young people, these baby boomers, are struggling to figure out their purpose, their sense of purpose, and what it is they're supposed to be doing, who it is that they're supposed to be, and what it is they're supposed to believe in, right? Because for the entirety of their lives, they are told that they're supposed to fit in a specific box, right? That's what conformity is. Conformity is all about fitting in, that you're supposed to look a certain way, act a certain way, believe certain things. And telling this to a teenager or to a college student isn't going to work. Because that's not what they want to do. They want to challenge the status quo, and they want to push back on that. So they start to wear different types of clothes. They start to read different types of books, read different types of poetry, listen to different kinds of music. Their hairstyle is different. Everything that they're doing privately is different than what their parents had taught them. The loudest and most in your face, of course, is rock and roll. So Chuck Berry is one thing because it's Chuck Berry, but when a white guy who's raised in the church singing church songs, and it has a down home country good old boy personality, and being from Mississippi, just a good boy, grows up to be a rock and roll star who dances in such suggestive ways for the 1950s that when he's on television, the camera can only show the top half of his body. There's a problem, okay? Of course, I'm talking about Elvis Presley. When we talk about Elvis Presley, Presley is insanely popular, but especially among young white women. There are concerts that he will hold, and I used to show this clip, but I don't have the time for it. But clips of these young girls who are literally screaming their heads off as he performs songs like Hound Dog, which was a song originally written and performed by a black woman, but it has an entirely different feel and different weight when it's performed by Elvis Presley, right? Because how he performs it is different and what it says is different, right? Because here is this young white man, again, a good boy from Mississippi who went to church and everything, who's now singing what is described often as black music, right? And he's incredibly successful at it, right? He is insanely popular. Thousands and thousands of young people buy his music, buy his albums. There are also a lot of young men who think that he is the enemy because they're the girls that they like Elvis better than they like them. It's the stories that I could tell you about what happens to Elvis's car and all sorts of things. It's so bizarre. But Elvis becomes the embodiment of how widespread the popularity of rock and roll is, right? And this is also happening in how the written word is a part of this rebellion too. Beatniks are a part of the baby boomer generation, but they are writers. They are writing stories and they are writing poems, but in their stories and in their poems, they are focusing on things that are basically about living a life in which stuff does not satisfy you. Buying a house, having a career, having a family, those are not the goals that you have in life. That true happiness is found in nature. That true happiness is sought out in seeking peace with others. So one of the most famous writers of the era is a guy named Jack London, who will talk about adventures out in the wilderness, especially in the Alaskan wilderness, and what it's like to be out in nature and not inhibited by an economy's demands, or trying to fit into a box of what somebody else expects for you. So while young white middle class America is rebelling that way, there are civil rights activists who are rebelling in another way, right? So I told you that civil rights activists in a lot of ways are described as and seen as anti-American and, suspected communists and all of this stuff. So I want to talk about how the civil rights movement is or can be divided into two wings in the 1950s. One is the courtroom fight of the civil rights movement. The courtroom fight is essentially where the lawsuits take place. And I think the most quintessential, the most famous lawsuit of the 1950s for civil rights is Brown v. Board of Education. The full name of it is Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So Brown v. Board, what most people don't know is that this is an umbrella case, meaning there are a few other cases that are tied to this larger case, okay? So Brown v. Board is about a man in Kansas, obviously. Oliver Brown had a little girl who had to go to school at the school for black children. And the thing is, the school that was actually closest to her home was a white school. But she had to walk to a bus stop, which was a few blocks away, and then the bus would then drive her several miles away to the black school. And Oliver Brown and something like 12 other families, all of them black, joined in this lawsuit for the opportunity to send their children to white schools. And so they are actively recruited to be a part of this lawsuit. What I mean is there is a lawyer affiliated with the NAACP by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall is pictured here. That's the guy right here in the middle. Thurgood Marshall is the lead attorney for the NAACP, and a part of what he does is he looks for opportunities to challenge the law for the sake of the civil rights cause. And so one of the questions that comes up is, okay, we have to challenge segregation on a legal basis, but how are we going to do it? Because segregation is such a huge issue. It affects so many different areas, so many different walks of life. So you can't just challenge segregation. So they decide to start with education because education affects a person from the time they're a child, and it goes all the way up at least until high school, if not beyond, okay? So why not start with education? So when we talk about how this court case goes, the court case first goes to a district court in Kansas, and in the district court, the Browns lose their case, right? The district court says, well, the Supreme Court has already established the precedent of separate but equal. So, I don't know what you're hullabalooing about. We've already fought this fight. You don't have anything to stand on. So they decide that they're going to appeal the ruling and take this case to the Supreme Court. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it gives Thurgood Marshall and his fellow attorneys a chance to revamp their argument a bit. And two, it gives them a chance to take their case to a different court with a new Chief Justice. And that's the guy pictured in the bottom right corner, Chief Justice Earl Warren. So here's how they revamp their argument. Thurgood Marshall decides that rather than just telling the story of how these children have to go further away to get to a school and talking about the inconvenience of all of that, he decides to focus on the psychological impact of segregation on children. So they look at a study that's conducted by a couple of child psychologists. And the psychologists basically look at or interview a group of black children. And these are elementary age black children. And in this particular case, in interviewing these black children are asked, each black child is asked the same question. So they're not asked together, they're asked individually the same set of questions. They're presented with a black doll and a white doll. And they are asked questions like, Which doll is more successful? Which doll is prettier? Which doll is uglier? Which doll is poorer? Which doll is smarter? Which doll is dumber? For every positive question, every single child chose the white doll. For every negative question, every single child chose the black doll. Okay? And keep in mind, these are young kids. These are elementary school age kids. And what these psychologists concluded is that segregation taught these children that because they were black, they were less than, that their blackness made them less than their white counterparts. That's the argument that Marshall presents to the Supreme Court. Now, there are other arguments involved as well, so it becomes much more complicated than that. Other questions, other issues involved, but this is at the heart of the argument. Now, let's talk about why Chief Justice Earl Warren is incredibly important here. So Warren is new to the court, and the reason why he is appointed by Dwight Eisenhower is because Dwight Eisenhower thinks, okay, I need a guy who's going to be as mellow as possible. This is a guy who's not going to cause me any trouble, not going to bring any attention to the court, keep things calm. But here's what you need to know about Warren. Warren was the Attorney General of California at the time of Japanese internment during World War II. And Warren was the guy who actually pushed for Japanese internment. He demanded it. He called for it, said that the California government should do it. And when the California government didn't, he helped push for it at the federal level. So he is partially responsible for the executive order that led to Japanese internment. And once it started to happen, he realized very quickly that he was wrong, that what he had done, what he had contributed to, was terribly wrong. And from that moment, what he realized was he would spend the rest of his life righting that wrong, trying to undo the impact of that wrong in whatever way he possibly could. So when Warren hears this argument, he knows that there's only one clear answer. And the one clear answer is separate but equal does not work in education. If these children are learning at a young age that they are less than, then separate but equal is trash. It's garbage. It doesn't actually convey that message. So he goes to each of his 8 other justices and he says, you have to vote this way. You have to strike down separate but equal. In education, you have to strike it down. Separate but equal does not work. And he sought out a unanimous ruling because what he knows for sure is that if the ruling was 5-4 or 6-3 or even 8-1, he knows that somebody is going to look at the dissenting voters and the dissenting justices, and say, well, see, there's some gray area. There's some debate. There's somebody who disagrees and thinks that separate but equal works. Warren wants to send a clear message. And think about this. The court is made up of Northerners and Southerners. It's made up of liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. Warren is a Republican. And Warren says the message needs to be clear that we all agree separate but equal does not work. So Warren himself writes the court's opinion, and he says that there is no place for separate but equal in American law. There is no place for separate but equal in the United States. And he orders for the integration of public schools. That's great. Good job. Here's the problem. In his ruling, he does not set a firm date. He just says something to the effect of, with some kind of, as soon as possible. Just think of it that way, as soon as possible. Okay? He doesn't set a firm date. He doesn't say something like by September 1st, 1955, or by January 1st, 1955. Nothing like that. He just says, ASAP or whenever you can. That's essentially what he says, which is why there are some schools, even in Oklahoma, who don't integrate until the 1970s. They don't integrate until the 1970s because they got to interpret, as soon as possible, or with all swift, impediency, or whatever he called it, as whenever they got around to it, right? That's the thing. Because he didn't set a firm date, they just did whatever they could with it, right? So there was a great victory there, but there were some ways in which it was impeded. Now, the other side of the grassroots level of the civil rights movement, the other side of the movement is through the grassroots side of the movement. When I say grassroots means people who work at the ground level of a movement. So these are regular people who are fighting for the cause in their own way. And when we talk about people who are protesting at this level, these are people who are protesting by participating in marches, participating in boycotts, that sort of thing, okay? So when you are protesting in this way, you're putting yourself at some kind of risk, right? You're putting yourself in physical risk, but more often than not, economic risk. At least in the 1950s, we'll talk about how that changes in the 1960s. But when we talk about how it begins in the 1950s, we have to begin with the story of Emmett Till. And so I'm going to have this video clip give you some insight into Emmett Till's story.
Old Emmett Till, in the summer of 1955, was one of the most painful moments in the history of American race relations. It was also a key turning point for the modern civil rights movement, using the mass media to galvanize protests to demand the end of Jim Crow segregation and equality before the law. The decision to publish the unvarnished photograph of her son's brutally battered head and face was made by one courageous person, Emmett Till's grieving mother, Mamie Till Mobley.
Emmett Till was the 14-year-old black boy from Chicago who was lynched by white supremacists in Money, Mississippi on August 28, 1955. Emmett Till's body was recovered from the Tallahatchie River with a 125-pound cotton gin fan belt tied around his neck.
Chris, take me back to September 3rd, 1955.
Well, it was the beginning of 4 days of process of viewing the body of Emmett Till, and we estimate something like 100,000 people came to view his body in an open casket that his mother had designed.
She allowed the press to photograph his body, and those photographs were published in Jet magazine. Her decision to open the casket, to allow those gruesome photographs to be published, served as a catalyst for the next phase of the civil rights movement.
What we saw in the mutilated remains of Emmett Till caused a death of innocence of this country. We had to realize, as Mamie Till Mobley expresses, that there were no more innocent bystanders. We all had to take responsibility and become active in turning things around.
What effect did this have on Mamie?
Well, she was devastated, but was able to mine her grief for a mission.
If the death of my son can mean something to the other unfortunate people all over the world, then for him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died.
It's a story that still has resonance today, as we see the name Emmett Till is raised every time another black male is taken down in an act of violence by a white perpetrator, even a white authority figure who gets away with it.
Although Emmett's murderers walked free, Mamie Till Mobley's prescient use of the media was a dramatic turning point in the movement. Just a few months later, Rosa Parks would refuse to move from her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama, launching the modern civil rights movement. Today, the widespread use of social media.
So I'm going to stop it there because I want to spend more time talking about Emmett Till for a second. So when we talk about the story of Emmett Till, Emmett Till is a 14-year-old kid who is an only child. So Mamie Till only has one son. And in the summer of 1955, Mamie Till asks him, hey, what do you want to do this summer? Let's travel somewhere. And he decides he's going to visit his uncle in Money, Mississippi. And he's never been to Mississippi before. He's never traveled to the Deep South. He's from Chicago. This is a Chicago kid. And so he doesn't know about life in Mississippi. He doesn't know what it's like for Black people in Mississippi. And so against everything she says to him, and she's thinking for him, Mamie Till sends him on a train down to Money, Mississippi, and that's the last time she sees him alive. On a dare, 14-year-old kid, this 14-year-old Emmett Till, on a dare, whistles at a white woman in a store, right? So she's working behind a cash register, and Emmett Till is with his cousins and a couple of friends, and Till is bragging about a supposed white girlfriend that he has or something like that, because that's what 14-year-old guys do. And so they say to him, okay, well, if that's the case, then you'll have no problem whistling at that white woman in the store. So Emmett Till, being, again, 14-year-old boy, goes in, whistles at her, says something like, hey, baby, and then walks away. What ends up happening is that woman told her husband, and her husband then says something to her brother. So her husband, or to his brother. So her husband and brother-in-law go to Emmett's uncle's house, and they go there in the middle of the night, knock on the door, and demand that his uncle bring Emmett to the door. He refuses, of course. So they barge their way in. They're looking for Emmett. They find him. They drag him out of bed. And that's the last time Emmett Till is seen alive by any of his loved ones. His body was found 3 days later, beaten and bloated beyond recognition. And you heard the story of what happened to his murderers. There was a trial, and the trial is a joke of a trial. So when we talk about what actually happens during the trial, it's a very quick trial. They take very little, the jury takes very little time in deciding their ruling. But essentially, what ends up happening is an all-white jury find them not guilty. And the reason why we know it's them, because in case you're wondering, well, how do you know they were the guys who did it? So Look magazine decided that they were going to approach these two guys because they're really arrogant. And they're also protected by the legal clause of double jeopardy, right? So they've already been found not guilty. They can't be brought up on charges again, at least not on this case. So Look magazine approaches them in like a year later and says, hey, we'll pay you money. We'll pay you a couple $1,000 if you tell us what you did to Emmett Till. And so they told the story for a couple $1,000. They told the story, which is how we know exactly what they did to Emmett Till. We know that they beat him. They beat him to death with like different batons, with the butt of their guns, and then they drowned him in the river. By the time the body was discovered, the only way the body could be identified, and you saw his images there, the only way he was identified was the fact that he was wearing a pinky ring that his mother recognized. So this was traumatic to say the least. And what Mamie Till did in that moment was incredibly courageous. But she wanted everyone to see her son. In fact, what she tells Jet Magazine is this: this could be your son, you or your son, whether you protest or not. And so for those people sitting on the sideline, not doing anything, not willing to participate, and not willing to demand change, Mamie Till is the one who basically says, this could be you. This could be your children. This is what's been happening. Now, Jet Magazine is targeted to Black audiences. This is not a mainstream magazine. It's targeted to Black audiences. And as you saw from the video, one particular person and one particular group moved by what happened to Emmett Till, of course, is Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks had always been, for a long time actually, working for the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama. She had been a secretary for them, for her local chapter, and she'd also been a seamstress, so she knows a lot of people in her community, right? She's active in her church. She knows a lot of people. She's a middle-aged woman, and she hasn't done a single thing to break the law ever, right? And the NAACP had been looking for ways to challenge segregation laws on the public transportation system in Montgomery, but they had failed in their previous attempts. And after Emmett Till was lynched and Rosa Parks saw his pictures, Parks says, I'll be the one to challenge the segregation laws. I'll be the one to get arrested. So when she refuses to give up her seat on the bus, she's not giving up her seat because she's actually tired, because her feet are tired. She refuses to give up her seat because she's tired of this treatment, right? She's tired of what's happening to her people. What happens as a result is the Black residents of Montgomery boycott using the buses of Montgomery. And as a result, the bus system, the transit system in Montgomery lose a tremendous amount of money. So they challenge the economic standings of the city. And so after they start losing that much money, I mean, people are walking to work, they're arranging carpools. Those women, Black women who worked for white women as, housekeepers or nannies, white women would actually drive across town and pick up Black women from their neighborhoods and then drive them back to the white side of the city. This went on for over a year. And finally, the Montgomery bus transit system, bus/transit system, integrated the whole system. So a Black passenger could sit wherever they want on the buses, regardless of who else was riding. So let's talk about the significance of the bus boycott. There are two main things that you've got to remember from this boycott. One, and this is probably most important, it's the lesson that regular people can make a difference, that you don't have to be a Thurgood Marshall and argue before the Supreme Court to make a difference. You can be a seamstress like Rosa Parks and have a huge impact. It's going to require dedication. You have to be committed to it. You've got to be willing to commit the time and the effort, but you can make a difference. The second is the emergence of a new civil rights leader, and that is Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., when the boycott begins, is brand spanking new to Montgomery, Alabama. He had just been hired to serve as the pastor of one of the Baptist churches in the area. So after Rosa Parks is arrested, that evening, there's a huge meeting that is called at one of the churches, and a bunch of the black members of the community have gathered together to talk about what needs to happen, what is our next strategy, why we need to care. And so the ministers come together and they say, hey, Martin, you're a good speaker. How about you get up there and say something? And King says, yeah, okay, I could do it. So he gets up there and gives a speech, and that's really his launching point. That's where he really becomes a leader of the people, right? And so he eventually becomes the face of the civil rights movement, at least for this generation. What I want you to understand is the court side of the fight and the grassroots side of the fight both are necessary for the advancement of civil rights in this country. You need somebody to challenge the laws using the law. You need somebody willing to look at the laws and challenge it legally, but you also need people to challenge things using protests, using boycotts, and showing that regular people do believe in the power of the citizenry. Now, none of this happens without any kind of backlash, right? Southern congressmen are going to write a petition in which they challenge Earl Warren's ruling, and they will publicly state their criticisms of this ruling. And so I just want to mention this. You're not going to be tested on it or anything. I just want to say this just to make sure that you understand that this progress, in whatever way it happens, does not happen easily, and it's not linear. So it always comes back. It's almost as if there's, for every 3 steps forward, there are always 2 steps back. So it's a back and forth struggle to make any real kind of progress with civil rights in this country. I'm going to move on from that and take us to the early part of 1960s. Specifically the election of 1960 between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And I'm going to be really brief here, but I just want to explain what happens between these two men. John F. Kennedy is a young guy, a senator from Massachusetts, and in comparison to Richard Nixon, does not have the same level of experience as Richard Nixon. But Kennedy knows how to campaign a little bit better. Kennedy knows how to work the camera a little bit better. Nixon doesn't seem to understand, or he underestimates the power of the camera. Nixon literally travels to every single state in the Union. He goes to all 50 states, Alaska and Hawaii included. Kennedy is more strategic. And in the end, what ends up happening is Kennedy is able to present himself as the visionary, whereas Nixon presents himself as the old hand, the guy who represents the old way of thinking. It's a life lesson for Nixon. So while he leaves in defeat, there are lessons that he learns from this. And in the meantime, while the American people are excited about a brand new president coming into office, there is something that Eisenhower has to say. Eisenhower is, in his farewell address, which is a tradition that Washington establishes way back when, Eisenhower creates a term called the military-industrial complex. And in creating this term and giving this speech, he is acknowledging the times in which we live, but also reminds the American people of the values for which we fight. And with that, we are going to lead into Kennedy's America.